cancer is one of the leading causes of death worldwide. And despite advances in the field of early cancer detection and treatment, it's still a disease that directly or indirectly will affect most people at some point in their lives. So the most common treatments used to date are surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation. Other options include targeted therapy, immunotherapy, laser, hormonal therapy. These treatment strategies are based on the widely accepted theory that cancer is caused by genetic changes that trigger cells to grow out of control. Our guest today will be challenging this theory, suggesting that we may not be treating cancer as effectively as we could. And as Gemma has already said, our guests today are Dr. Thomas Seyfried, Professor of Biology at Boston College, and Dr. Paul Marik, Pulmonary and Critical Care Specialist and Chairman and Chief Scientific Officer of the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance, also known as the FLCCC. Dr. Marik recently authored a review of the published literature discussing the use of repurposed drugs to improve cancer patient outcomes when used in addition to standard oncological treatments. But let me start with you, Dr. Seyfried. So you've written, amongst over 150 other peer-reviewed publications, the groundbreaking book, Cancer as a Metabolic Disease, on the origin, management, and prevention of cancer. To help our audience understand, could you perhaps briefly outline what the theory that cancer is a metabolic mitochondrial disease is about and what implications it might have on treatment and prevention of cancer?
Yes, well, thank you very much to have this opportunity to share with you some of our ideas on how cancer starts and, most importantly, how to manage cancer. And you're absolutely correct. The dogmatic view today is that cancer is a genetic disease where the dysregulated growth of cells, which is actually the definition of cancer, it's a cell division out of control or dysregulated cell growth. So the question, of course, is that what is responsible for this dysregulated growth? Is it mutations within the nucleus that are referred to as the somatic mutation theory, which is the predominant view of what cancer is? Or what's responsible for cancer, or is it a mitochondrial metabolic disorder, as I and others have described? The idea that cancer is a metabolic disease arises with the work of Otto Warburg, one of the great scientists from the 20th century. He was very clear in his definition of what cancer was. Basically, it was a shift in energy metabolism from oxidative phosphorylation, using oxygen for energy, shifting to an ancient pathway of energy that is fermentation, which is energy without oxygen. And we all clearly know cancer cells are very different from normal cells because they live without oxygen. They don't need oxygen, all right? This is the whole thing. And even cancer cells that consume oxygen, when cancer cell is actually consuming oxygen, it's not using it for energy, it's using it to produce ROS, reactive oxygen species. These ROS are carcinogenic and mutagenic. So cancer has many origins that I've gone over. You know, you have radiation, carcinogens, intermittent hypoxia, inflammation, some rare inherited mutations. All of these are considered risk factors. All of these risk factors damage in some way or another the mitochondria within the cell that produces energy through oxidative phosphorylation. It has to be a gradual disruption because an acute disruption would kill the cell right out, and you'll never get cancer from a dead cell. So there's a gradual transition in the ability of the cell to generate energy. And when that transition becomes more complete from OXPHOS to fermentation, you get dysregulated cell growth. The very organelle that controls the metabolic homeostasis within the cell is the mitochondrion. It also maintains the quiescent state, the growth regulated state. So the very organelle that maintains what we call normalcy becomes corrupted. The cell falls back on a fermentation metabolism, and the very organelle needed to maintain the differentiated state is no longer there. So cells fall back in what we call the default state, the state that they would have if they were no longer under active control, and that is dysregulated cell growth. The interesting thing is that we also have when we have liver regeneration. These are normal cells that will grow every bit as fast, if not faster, than cancer cells. The main difference between a hepatoma, which is a liver tumor, and liver regeneration is the cells in the liver during regeneration are regulated. The mitochondria are still maintaining and calling the metabolic shots within the cell, whereas the hepatoma has lost the mitochondrial function. Thereby, you have growth, but it's dysregulated, and it's driven by fermentation metabolism, whereas liver regeneration is driven by oxidative metabolism. So not all cell growth is considered cancerous. We have regulated growth and we have dysregulated growth. So when we look back and see where do all these mutations come from, why does the field focusing on things that are largely downstream or mostly irrelevant, to be honest with you? You have what we call the crisis. Thousands of people are dying in all these different countries. They're being treated by medieval forms of treatment, not related to the biology of what the actual problem is. So the biology of the problem is dysregulated cell growth driven by a fermentation metabolism because the oxidative phosphorylation system is defective. And as the result of this, we have cell division out of control. Metastasis is actually driven by our own immune system. We've published many, many papers on this. Most of the metastatic cells that you see in all the various human tumors are hybrid kind of cells with the macrophage, which is the macrophage is part of our immune system. When that becomes corrupted, that cell is already programmed to enter and exit tissues. So you have rogue macrophages fermenting and moving through various organs. So you can have lung cancer spread to brain, you can have breast to brain, and you can have these various cells spreading around the whole system. And then this becomes, and we have to understand, the only two major fuels driving cancer are the sugar glucose and the amino acid glutamine. Glutamine provides both carbons and nitrogen for synthesis of DNA and proteins and RNA. And the carbons from glucose will be used for synthesis of lipids and proteins. So these two fuels are powerfully synergistic with each other, driven by a fermentation metabolism. When the cells ferment, they can't use fatty acids or ketone bodies because these are non-fermentable fuels. So the way you can control cancer is you simply deprive the cells of their fermentable fuels while transitioning the entire body off to fatty acids and ketone bodies. This now marginalizes the tumor cells and gradually will eliminate them. And we've published the press pulse therapeutic strategy for how you can degrade slowly. You bring the body into a state of therapeutic ketosis first, allow metabolic homeostasis to be recovered, and then we strategically use drugs and procedures that will slowly restrict the availability of the two fermentable fuels driving the beast. Okay, when we do this, we can then gradually eliminate the cancers in people. At the same time, we restore their overall health and vitality because the normal cells of the body get healthier when they burn ketones and fatty acids, and the cancer cells are slowly degraded. So this will become the future of cancer management and prevention once the scientific community comes to understand what I'm saying and releases the dogmatic ideology that seems to be paralytic to almost the entire cancer industry. So that's pretty much, I said, that's like hundreds and hundreds of papers, detailed biochemical analysis, large amounts of preclinical studies. But I'll be happy to answer any more detailed questions, but I put that into kind of a nutshell there.
From what you said, it sounds like you have been overseeing the treatment of humans, or is this mainly working with laboratory animals, or how far advanced is there a protocol of any types already in place? Well,
yeah, thank you. We wrote the press pulse therapeutic strategy as a framework. We're now fleshing that out for the treatment of patients. I'm not a physician. I can't treat anybody, but I work with a large number of physicians, oncologists that can treat people. And we're finding, interestingly enough, the humans respond far better and more effectively to these therapies than do some of the preclinical systems. Dogs respond really well. You have to realize that the problem with cancer is a fundamental problem of energy metabolism in metazoan cells, mammalian cells. So this cuts across mice, dogs, cats, humans. I mean, the problem is just one of fundamental biology and biochemistry. But it's the basal metabolic rate of the system that allows the therapies to work best. And humans, we are evolved as a starved species. Food was never really abundant for eons in our existence. And we are capable of massively restricting calories. And this puts tremendous pressure on the tumor cells. So you push them over the edge with a little bit repurposed drugs and things like this. You can get rid of these cancers with minimal toxicity. Now, it's not easy. I have to be honest with you. This is not like a walk in the park. I mean, the patient has to play a major role in the management of their disease, along with the knowledge of with a physician that would be knowledgeable.
And so what you're basically saying is that someone should be going on a very strict ketogenic diet. Is that really the way to go?
Well, that's been thought to be the case. But we published the glucose ketone index calculator, which gives us a quantitative biomarker for allowing a person to know whether or not they're in a state of ketosis. Now, if someone were to do this with a ketogenic diet, a Mediterranean diet, a vegan diet, a carnivore diet, doesn't make any difference.
Okay.
The bottom line is, can you get into a low GKI value of 2.0 or below? And if you can do that with any kind of a diet, it's just that a ketogenic diet might be able to help you get to the promised land a little bit faster. Not to say that you can't do it with another diet, but when people ask me, can you eat this or can you eat that? I said, I don't know. What does it do to your GKI? If your GKI is 2.0 or below, then continue to do what you're doing. It's not that. It's a good quantitative biomarker.
I see. Yeah.
So anyway.
And then there's also the issue with glutamine, which is not so easy to be, it's not easy to limit glutamine because it's quite abundant in the human body, isn't it?
Yeah.
How is that managed then? Do you have drugs or?
Well, bottom line is that, yes, it's the most abundant amino acid in our body, extremely important amino acid. Urea cycle, the gut, our immune system are all heavily glutamine dependent. So that's why in the press pulse, you can press glucose down really, really low because we can transition over to ketones. Glutamine, on the other hand, my late good friend, George Cahill from Joslin Diabetes Center, showed that after 14 to 20 days of water-only fasting, your blood sugar starts to go down. But, a lot of people, that would be extremely difficult. So there are drugs. The problem is in using glutamine targeting drugs, you have to be very strategic with it. You can't just press them. That's why we call it pulse. You have the dosage, timing, and scheduling. And that's where we are right today. We're trying to figure out the best dosage, timing, and scheduling to pulse glutamine targeting. So you can't just go in there aggressively because you're going to harm the body. So you really have to know how to strategically use glutamine targeting drugs. They should not be employed by themselves. They can work a little bit. They'll never work as well if you're targeting glucose. You need to target glucose and glutamine simultaneously, but you need to know how to do it correctly.
Okay. And all these traditional treatments like chemotherapy, radiation, do they not have a place within your proposed protocol, or is that completely not necessary then anymore, or in your view?
Well, that's a very important point. I think it's going to be a transition period where we're going to the key thing is that if you're in therapeutic ketosis with a glucose ketone index of 2.0 or below, the chemotherapies, cisplatin, doxorubicin, and all these very, very, very toxic drugs, they might also have better therapeutic benefit at far, far lower concentrations once the patient is in this new metabolic state. So it's not necessary to be dousing people with so much chemical. Those chemicals could still be used again, but that we have to reevaluate the dosing regimens for these kinds of chemicals. Radiation we know radiation can be effective for certain very difficult to surgically resect type cancers. And again, radiation will raise blood sugar levels. So it's very important that the patient maintain as low blood sugar as possible.
Right.
The only time radiation would, in my mind, would never be used is in brain tumors. We have published many papers showing that in fact, that contributes to the demise and death of the majority of GBM patients. Unfortunately, it's a tragedy. It's an unbelievable tragedy because it frees up massive amounts of glucose and glutamine in the tumor microenvironment, leading to the rapid recurrence and death of the patient. So I think that that's one area where we should abolish radiation. But
Right.
But I think for other parts, other cancers, it may still have some utility,
Okay.
and maybe the choice modality under the right condition.
Yeah. I see Christoph has a question. Do you want to go ahead and ask, Christoph?
Yeah, sure, Linda. Well, one thing that our current medical system has been lacking for quite a long time, we can debate how many years, that has been going on, is looking at the causes of diseases. Yeah, just being interested in the treatment approaches. In terms of the real explosion of the cancer rate in comparison to, for example, 100 years ago, what are for you the main causative agents? I mean, Professor Katami talked about the role of chronic inflammation in our system, and we know we're surrounded by etiological factors that promote inflammation. We know that vaccines could play a big role into this, general toxins in our environment. What is your take on why we're seeing the number that we're seeing? Obviously, diet has something to do with it as well, but could you summarize your vision on it?
Yeah, well, we know that it's very, very difficult to get cancer if your mitochondria and the cells of the body, organs and tissues remain healthy. So what's happened over the last 50 or 75 years to cause this explosion is diet and lifestyle environmental issues that cause, as you said, chronic inflammation, damages oxidative phosphorylation in different types of cells and tissues. We know more exposure to carcinogens will damage mitochondrial oxphos. Intermittent hypoxia will do this. You have a variety of effects, what we call secondary provocative agents. The obesity epidemic has now replaced smoking as one of the most important risk factors. Oftentimes, those folks have type 2 diabetes. There's what we call very major disturbances in metabolic homeostasis as the result of diet and lifestyle issues. Let's put it this way, largely from the environment. Our bodies are supremely resistant to getting cancer. It's just that we have now put ourselves in such an incredible level of provocative agents that to parse out what exactly caused a cancer in one person or another. But we know that every cancer that we have looked at are fermenters, meaning that they must have had damage to the oxidative phosphorylation mitochondrial structure and function in that particular group of cells or tissues. So the key is that goes back to prevention. So how do you prevent cancer? You do things that are going to keep your mitochondria healthy, and the probability of getting cancer would be significantly reduced.
So if we would put you in the position as head of the CDC today, and you would start a preventative program, what would be the first things you would recommend to be implemented?
Well, we would do things that we would know could help our mitochondria health. The food pyramids would have to be dramatically changed. People need to know that exercise is absolutely essential. We evolved as an exercise species. Sitting in cars and traffic all day long is not in our best interests, health-wise. The availability of highly processed carbohydrate foods almost everywhere I think we can't get rid of these things, but all we can do is identify the health risks that those things would produce, because you can't tell people not to eat a certain thing. You're just not going to do that. But I think the educational mission, is important, and that is not going to happen from major food and drug industry. So it would have to be a government thing. If the government is capable of doing that itself, regardless of what society you happen to live in. But clearly, it's very difficult to get cancer if you keep your mitochondria healthy, because that's the origin of cancer, mitochondrial damage. So what people would say, well, how do I keep my mitochondria healthy? Avoid obesity. Obesity. If people knew that obesity was a risk factor, either they don't care or they don't know. But that tells us that there's a lot of missing information here. But I think this is the key. And I don't know. We're not in the position of telling people what they should or should not do. We should just give them the information, let them make their own choices.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Dr. Wai-Ching Lee would like to ask a question as well. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Seyfried. May I ask if you have, in preventive care, have you researched also the application of, say, applied kinesiology to check if the people who have cancer can eliminate certain inflammatory foods such as wheat or dairy products, or the common ones such as honey or even cashew nuts and peanuts? So that seems to be an important part in nutrition, which is actually my field.
Yeah, I wish I could speak to that in a more intelligent way. All I know is that when you have a low GKI, regardless of what you're eating, it's hard to get cancer. Don't forget, we evolved as a starved species. Our Paleolithic ancestors were always in a state of ketosis. They didn't have a lot of the things that we are exposed to. And you always have to go back. We're just, it was hundreds of thousands of years we've been running around chasing and killing animals. We didn't have farms and we didn't have this or that. And you have to say, we were pretty much in a very low carbohydrate, high exercise environment. So you introduce a lot of things from the Neolithic period, 10,000 years ago up to now, and complex carbohydrates from corn and rice and wheat are not necessarily problematic. It's more of the highly processed carbohydrates, lack of exercise, all these, and the chemicals in their environment that represent a more acute problem today than they did in the past.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Just, I would like to bring Dr. Marik in, if that's okay, Christoph. Yeah. Or do you have another question?
Yeah, just one final question. I'd love to hear from Paul as well, because when we talk about health in our times, we often push the responsibility back to the consumer. But if you look at the choice that many people have, if you look at the food index in some parts of America, even access to natural food has become very, very difficult for them. So in Finland, I just wanted to come back to the giving the responsibility back to the industry, because in Finland, when they knew that too much salt was bad for high blood pressure, the government set limits to the industry. And in the next year, there was a 50% decline in heart attacks. So I'd just like to point out that I think it's fair enough to educate people, but what would be your take on how to actually tackle the people that caused the problem in the first place, namely the industry?
Yeah, well, you have to realize Calvin Coolidge said the business of America is business. That's the bottom line, and it controls everything. Big money, politics. It's all wrapped into one. It's the culture. Some countries, they have different culture. They'll respond to government action in a little bit more unified way. I don't see it happening in this country. So, but that's just the way it is. I mean, people want to make a lot of money. It's driven this way. So but I still think there's an educational, those folks that want to know about this, the government, we have, everybody says, well, we want the government out of our business. And then other times they say, oh, no, we want the government to do things for us, right? So it's kind of a balancing act. I don't like to get into that because there's just so much controversy about it. I like to stick to this underlying science that is responsible for what the problem is.
I'd just like to share something that we've been doing and include a question maybe to both of you. We've been trying to tackle cancer in combination of the different therapists, from holistic dentists to doctors of different specialities, environmental doctors, with detoxification protocols, etc. Basically summarizing that, yeah, we also approve a diet that includes glucose management. We're more into the whole food plant-based concept of Professor Campbell with the China study and his conclusions out of this. We do pH control, we do inflammatory control, as Paul was just showing, omega-3, curcumin, etc. Vitamin D is an essential part of it. Dental state, if you look at Rantes, pro-inflammatory cytokine that is released and associated with, i.e., breast cancer. So dental status is a huge topic. But one thing I wanted to ask both of you is salt management has become a huge topic as well. And it was basically triggered by a discussion of Dr. Gerson and Dr. Albert Schweitzer, in which he was asked why in Lamborghini he saw, when he was working with Albert Schweitzer, that is, was working over there, had found this shift to cancer in the area that he was taking care of, that didn't know cancer at all. And he was of the opinion that too much sodium actually suppresses intracellular potassium, thus leading to deformations of and malfunctions of cell and mitochondria. So what we do also is we do intracellular potassium measurements, and it's incredibly accurate in determining the pro-inflammatory state of the body. So do you have any take on salt intake, or does it not matter in your approach?
So I'm not an expert, so I really can't give a lot of advice. I mean, we do know that a high sodium, low potassium diet generally is not good for hypertension, metabolic syndrome. So that would make sense. How particularly it interfaces with cancer and mitochondria, it's somewhat out of my area of knowledge.
Thanks.
Well, thank you. I can't really address too much about the salt issue either. But I know imbalances in too much of anything can kind of make things not work as well. I just wanted to touch upon one point about the embendazole as a repurposed drug. We just published a paper showing that embendazole can target glutamine. So it actually targets glucose and glutamine. So it's an excellent add-on. I would say it's a powerful repurposed drug used in the right way, because we have direct evidence now that it actually targets the very pathways needed to drive dysregulated cell growth. So I think that list of approaches for managing cancer is a very effective one, if people could follow that.
Yeah, so I mean, I must agree with Dr. Seyfried. So, mebendazole seems to be a very potent drug. I mean, particularly if you look in vitro and animal models. The problem is it's not a lot of clinical data. And so that's where the problem is, because people claim, I've treated thousands of patients with fembendazole or mebendazole, and, the patients are cured. Well, if they've treated thousands of patients, they should at least be able to do a small case series. The biggest case series is 3 patients. And so while, I think it is an important drug, and as Dr. Seyfried said, it targets multiple pathways, we do need more clinical data. That's the problem. So I think it is a viable drug. And what I don't understand is why these people who are treating these patients, they can't just put together a case series. They claim to have treated thousands of patients who've done so well. Well, if they've done so well, just publish your experience, you'll get it published. And so that's why I'm a little bit hesitant of anecdotes. One has to be careful about anecdotes, because, anecdotes are fine for clinical experience. It's not science. And we do need, really vigorous clinical studies.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. And I've heard the same claims and things like this. I try to publish everything, but to be honest with you, publishing human stuff is a hell of a lot more difficult than publishing stuff. The mice are very compliant patients, dogs and mice. Humans, you have to be very careful about, are they really adhering to what you're telling them? But the other thing is, we find that no one drug alone is a panacea for anything. When we use embendazole, it's with a calorie-restricted ketogenic diet. And then you start to see the real powerful effects, far greater than if you were to use one of these by themselves. So people have to come to realize that it's going to be a synergistic interaction of diet and repurposed drugs together that is going to lead to the greatest outcomes. But they're very hard to get published because they say, well, what's the really powerful one that's making the difference? The guy that's alive that no longer has any cancer, he doesn't really care. He just wants to know what the overall survival, progression-free survival, those are the markers that we should look for. And I think it will take time for people to come to realize this.
Yeah, so I agree with Dr. Seyfried 100% that, one drug doesn't do it. It has to be a combination, which makes it very difficult to do randomized controlled trials, which are completely inappropriate anyway. But what I would say is that's fine. Take a group of patients, give them a combination of 4 or 5 drugs plus metabolic control, and just track them with time and compare them to historical controls. That would be a reasonable study to do, and something that should be done. I think to do a randomized placebo-controlled trial is unethical. How can you give patients placebo when you have effective drugs? So I think what you can do is a combination of therapies, and then you can compare it to historical controls. I think that would be an acceptable solution to this problem. But certainly the standard randomized controlled trial just is not going to work.
No, I agree. I agree 100%. I think that's an impediment to this whole process of moving the field forward. Everybody feels that you have to have some sort of randomized control group or these kinds of things, and that has to be thrown out, because that's not applicable to metabolic therapy for cancer management. We have to have a new design, and I agree 100%. Historical controls. When you look at glioblastoma, very few people survive for 4 years. Historical controls by the thousands. And if you can keep people alive for 6 years or 7 years with a metabolic approach, it works.
I actually have a question from Shabnam to Dr. Marik. She says, you have lived in South Africa and now you're living in the US. What difference does geoculture, diet, and gut microbiome make in the prevention of cancer and other chronic conditions?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, Americans, much like Western people, eat processed food. They don't eat food. They eat processed food. And there's no question of doubt, one of the most important precipitators of cancer is processed food. There's overwhelming data that processed food per se causes cancer. There's data that sugar drinks, these sugar soda drinks themselves cause cancer. There's data that pure fruit juice, which is pure glucose, causes cancer. So there's no question of doubt that diet plays a major role. And 80% of what Americans eat is processed food. They don't really eat food. They eat synthetic, chemicalized stuff which looks like food. So that's a big difference, that, in non-Western countries, they do actually eat food. And so the difference between food and processed food is, if it looks like food, it's food. If it comes in a box and has a wrapper and has a package insert, that's not food. So it really doesn't matter what kind of food it is, but as long as we get back to eating real food.
Yep, I agree. So looking at the state of cancer treatment today, are people dying needlessly, would you say? It's a blunt question, but yeah.
Absolutely, and without question. So I actually was contacted by a patient over the weekend who told me that his oncologist and his surgeon said he could eat whatever diet he wanted to. It made absolutely no difference. And so that is what 99% of the standard of care is that, and that's why it's such a tragedy, is that the lack of insight and information, and this information's out there. It's not like it's hidden. You know, I showed you a publication in a prestigious cancer journal. This data is published. Dr. Seyfried has published this data in highly reputable journals. So this data is there in plain sight for everyone to see. They just don't want to see it.
Dr. Seyfried, do you agree? Do people die needlessly?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
When do you take a person sick and poison and irradiate them to make them healthy? I mean, it makes no sense. I call it medieval. And what's shocking to me, as Dr. Marik just said, most oncologists do not know that glucose makes tumors grow faster. That's why they say eat whatever you want, because they lack, it's scary to know that the person treating you for a serious disorder fundamentally lacks knowledge of the biology of the disease they're treating. I mean, that's very scary and unsettling, because these folks by the millions go to these top hospitals expecting to get appropriate treatment. And the folks at these hospitals are pretty much clueless as to the underlying mechanism that's driving their disorder. And that's not to say that we have millions of so-called cancer survivors who have tolerated an unbelievable torture and still survived. But many of them, and perhaps most, pay a serious price for their survival. They have hormonal imbalances, digestive imbalances, neuropsychiatric problems as the result of surviving these horrific treatments. So you're not getting out of this unscathed. In many ways. There are some people who live to be 90, and they do fine, but many people are dying. And these new immunotherapies, which are based on the somatic mutation theory of cancer, there's a term called hyper-progressive disease, where the treatments will kill you far faster than the disease itself. And this is well documented. It's published. Many papers in the scientific literature discuss hyper-progressive disease from the new immunotherapies. And you pay $100,000 and $200,000 for a treatment that will kill you faster than the disease. Now, that doesn't happen in everybody. You get about 20% of the people do respond really, really well. A large number have no effect, and then there's about 20% that are killed by the drug. And I think it's immoral. There's no reason why you should treat another member of our species with the remote possibility of killing them. Diet metabolic therapy, it doesn't kill you. It only makes you healthier. So, it's just like, what is going on here? I mean,
this is the question. What is going on? Really, it's perplexing listening to you.
I don't think it's that perplexing if you kind of look a little deeper as to what World Council for Health has been doing and what we've been doing. This is part of the overall plan. It's a war on repurposed drugs. Oncology is a $200 billion business. CAR-T therapy, which is what Dr. Seyfried was also implying, costs $500,000 per patient. So we're talking about repurposed drugs that you can get over the counter. So this is really part of the war against repurposed drugs, and there's no question that the motivations are financial. Just follow the money.
Is that what you think too, Dr. Seyfried? Is that your feeling?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, this is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it's a liaison between the academic industry and pharmacology. In 1984, the National Cancer Institute it's published on their website, they invite in the drug companies to make better drugs to treat cancer. But of course, the ultimate goal is to have very, very extremely expensive drugs. And I find it kind of ironic. Some of the wealthiest folks in the society were killed very quickly by these. Paul Allen of the Microsoft fame died quickly from some new therapy that it took. Same with Blake Nordstrom. Some of these drugs, they think that, I have the money, I can go and do that. But they better use caution, because I think the ones who are going to benefit from metabolic therapy are the folks that have very little money. They can't afford CAR T, and that might save their lives, actually. So it's going to be an interesting shift when you see more of the wealthy people dying or suffering the greatest from these so-called drugs, and the poor folks who can't afford that may eventually do a hell of a lot better. So it'll be an interesting demographic shift as we go forward.
Yes, I'm going to let you ask the question, Christoph, in a minute. I just wanted to ask, Dr. Seyfried, are you aware of an increase of so-called turbo cancers post-COVID and possibly the jabs as well? Dr. Marik will want to probably share his views on this. What is your view?
I don't know enough about it. Cancer in my mind is cancer. It's driven by a fermentation mechanism, regardless of whether, you get a stage 4 cancer, it's mostly turbo anyway. So, that's why they call it stage 4, because it's usually very life-threatening. But they're still driven by fermentation, regardless of what's going on. You can still manage them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Linda, the answer is yes. We're aware of very aggressive tumors in young people in unusual sites. We're aware of patients who were in remission who then developed uncontrollable cancer. And in fact, the spike protein damages the mitochondrion. So there are oncogenic viruses that damage the mitochondrion, of which SARS-CoV-2 and spike protein is one. So, we know from the DMED data, this is the Department of Defense data, that after the jabs, the incidence of metastatic cancer went up 200%. 200%. So I think that there is a pretty strong association between, being spiked with spike protein and cancers. But it's, there's unfortunately not a lot of published data.
Yeah. Christoph, did you want to ask?
Well, I actually wanted to jump on the same subject because there's so many different pathways, the P52 involvement, the CD4 and CD8 count discrepancy, the spike protein in the nucleus leading to a lack of DNA integrity, and now the finding of the SV40 in the shots. So there are quite a few mechanisms, and you already said that every second woman is expecting cancer nowadays. So I was also interested in the take on why this topic to educate people is such an important topic of our time. But coming back to another question, which I could add, coming back to health regulatory bodies, we know that with all the drugs that have been brought onto the market for cancer treatment, the health regulatory bodies relied completely on the data on the companies, and it was always about a 5-year survival rate, and there were never any long-term studies done in terms of the side effects of the treatments or the actual success rates over 5 years. And I'd be very interested in the opinion of the two speakers, how they would like to change this, because I think it's a fundamental problem in the system.
Yeah, so I'll just jump in. I think the randomized controlled trial needs to be ditched. It doesn't replicate real world practice, and the demand that these health agencies require to have 2 randomized controlled trials for a drug to be registered, I think is not based on common sense and good science. So I think the regulatory agencies need to change their regulations. And in fact, the FDA does actually acknowledge the value of prospective longitudinal studies. And I think that's where the focus needs to change. because what happens is the big pharma can game these randomized controlled trials. They predetermine the result, and so that they game the results. And so the randomized controlled trial has become a sham. And I think we need to move away from randomized controlled trials towards more real world experience with, prospective longitudinal studies.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree completely with that. Yeah, I think a major way to change the system is through education. First of all, the patient does not want radiation and chemo. In fact, they fear the treatment as much as they fear the disease. So it's up to the patients to make the change. If they go into the top medical schools and tell them, I want metabolic therapy, eventually the word's going to get out. If your clinic doesn't do metabolic therapy and someone else does, there's going to be a massive shift in where people want to go to be treated. So it's the people, because ultimately the patient is the consumer. The educated person will come in and say, I want metabolic therapy. You don't do it, I'm going somewhere else. I want to know about the kinds of diet changes. I want to know this to make myself healthy. So I think that's where it's going to, you can talk yourself blue in the face to the NCI and all these different funding, raise money for cancer. The more money you raise for cancer, the more cancer you get. The monies from those fundraisers goes to the same genetic approaches that have put us in this place, put us where we are in the first place. I agree. We use historical controls. We have to stop this nonsense about, double-blind crossover and all this crazy stuff. That perpetuates the problem. People need to know there is something other than poisonous chemicals, radiation, and even surgery. Surgery is important, but once you shrink that tumor down, get rid of the inflammation, and put it at significant risk, surgery can cure cancer if the tumor is in a reduced and indolent kind of state. But you don't go into it like a bull in a china shop and you cut the tumor. You could spread it through the person's body, causing a bigger problem. So again, we have tools. We just simply need to know how to use the tools we have in a much more effective way.
Now, we had quite a lot of questions in the newsroom. One of them is, have you ever attempted to create a cancer mitochondrial deficiency score? And is there a relation to response to a ketogenic diet? It's probably for Dr. Seyfried.
Yeah, well, mitochondria, just the fermentation. When your mitochondria are damaged, the fermentation of the tumor is increased. There's a direct, absolute, perfect correlation between how fermentative the tumor is and how badly the mitochondria are damaged. I mean, we've published these papers. We've looked at this. So that's all out there. The relationship. Dean Burke showed that many years ago as well.
And also, does the ketogenic diet work in some cancer types better than others? Most studies seem to be in GBM.
Listen, it's not so much the ketogenic diet as it is lowering blood sugar and elevating ketones. We have not yet found any cancer, and we're looking, that can survive without glucose and glutamine. Lung, bladder, colon, they're all fermenters. So, so the question is, you have a singular therapy that can manage all of these different cancers without toxicity, which is probably the most devastating thing the field can adjust to, right? I mean, lung is, we looked at lung. I went through all the major cancers. The mitochondria are damaged or deficient, structural determines function. They're all abnormal. So it's not so much the ketogenic diet. Any diet that will lower blood sugar and elevate ketones used with repurposed drugs is going to have a major impact on managing that disease. And I didn't say cure, I said manage.
Where do we go from here, though? I'm just wondering, people who are listening and have maybe loved ones who have cancer, or they might have a diagnosis themselves, and their doctors are not listening. You know, it's especially in the UK, where you're quite dependent on going to NHS hospitals unless you have the money to pay for private treatment. It is what's the best thing to do, really? It's educating patients, I suppose, isn't it? Mainly to get them to ask difficult questions. And Dr. Marik, just unmute.
Yes, sorry. Yes, it's empowering patients and educating patients. And in fact, the reverse role, patients now need to educate their doctors.
Yes.
Because most doctors are just so ignorant. And so if they can't get their knowledge, you know, through the medical journals, which they should, then the patients need to educate them. So, you know, we say that our monograph is for patients, but it's also for patients to give to their clinicians to read it, because the time has come that empowered patients now have to educate the doctors. And if the doctors won't listen, you need to find a new doctor.
Yeah, absolutely. Gemma, do you want to take over?
Well, I'd just be interested to know, thank you both, absolutely incredible conversation now. I'd just be interested to know what Dr. Seyfried thinks about moving forward. You've had Dr. Marik's thoughts there. You know, if you're the patient and you're terrified, you know, it's quite hard to empower your doctor because you're so busy trying to just get through the shock, aren't you, that this is happening?
Yeah, I know. It's right now we're in a very transitional period in this whole quest to manage cancer. The doctors are now being, as Dr. Marik said, confronted with patients that might know more about their condition than the doctor themselves, and that creates some degree of animosity. You don't like to be told that, you know, all your medical education in this field is not appropriate for the new realization of what this happens to be. The major medical schools are in the business of making money and maintaining their revenue. So there's a lot of factors coming together. As Upton Sinclair said, it's very difficult to get somebody to look at something different when their salary depends on them not being able to do that. So again, we're going to be in a very transitional period. My job is to focus predominantly on the science, which supports what Dr. Marik is saying. I think you have to fall back on hard, replicable science, the pathways, the evidence, scientific evidence, because you can pull things out of your hat, but you better have the science to support what you're saying. And we're in the process of resurrecting why Warburg was correct and some of the issues that made him run into all kinds of problems and attack. And we're addressing every one of those issues as we speak. We're also in the process of publishing a very comprehensive treatment protocol for glioblastoma. Myself and my physician colleagues are in the process of a very detailed treatment protocol for glioblastoma, because we go for this tumor because they have nothing. We have not made a single advance in glioblastoma in 100 years. We have the evidence to support that. So if we can double and triple the survivability of people with glioblastoma using a new treatment protocol, all the other cancers will eventually fall into place. But we have to start, and we have to just keep the pressure on and keep the education and the science going.